Hi, everybody. This is Paul Spacciali of Scality. This is the Scality podcast, and I'm, as usual, joined by my colleague, Giorgio Regni, our CTO. Hi, Giorgio.
Hi, Paul. Hi, everybody.
Hello. And continuing in our series of discussion topics, today we chose to discuss some of the analyst reports. So those of us in the tech industry and many of you that are buyers, prospective buyers, and users of technology know that you often depend on the analyst community, the tech analysts, to make recommendations, to evaluate products, to read the research. Even for us, Giorgio, as vendors, we look at the analysts a lot, right, for research, right? Do they do market sizing and things like that? But we wanted to zoom in a little bit on some of the vendor ranking reports and specifically on one from GigaOM. And so that's something that we've had a few years together with.
And so, Paul, how
Yep.
many have we done so far? Because I think every year there's at least 3 of them that we are playing to.
There's a lot. You're actually, that's a great point. With Gartner, you and I together have now been at it for 8, 9, 10 years. The
Mhm.
exact count
Yeah.
escapes me, but it's at least that much. With GigaOM, the radar reports, I think we've been doing for 3 or 4 years. But your point is they do multiple within
Yeah.
each tech sector, right? So in storage, they have object storage, file system storage, scale out storage, cloud storage. I think you're right. It's 3 a year, something like that,
Yeah. So at
right?
least maybe something like 30 we've been applying to so
Yeah, I
far.
think you're right. It's been a huge number, right? And I think in our minds, we think of kind of Gartner and IDC at the top of the pyramid, right there, what everybody thinks of as the tier one. But there are so many tier two and even these boutique firms. People may have heard of ESG. I don't know if you heard, Giorgio, but ESG and Omdia now became part of Tech Target.
Oh,
And
okay. I did not know that.
yeah, and Tech Target is now part of an even bigger company called Informa. So it's a whole umbrella of services and data research. You and I together dealt a lot with Evaluator Group in the past. Do you remember Randy Kearns?
Yes, I do.
Yep, Randy and Camberly Bates. They were been really good allies and great resources for us. But there's so many more, right? Let's, I think, really focus on GigaOM. I don't know if you remember this, but like 20 years ago, it was founded by this journalist, Om Malik. Does that name ring a bell?
Yeah, I met Om and I was on a plane with him to Paris. Remember?
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. I think I heard he ran it for like 9 years and then there were some financial concerns and then I guess he sold it, but I don't know all the history. Anyway, there's so much in this industry. I guess the focus for us though is these vendor research and ranking reports, right? And as I mentioned, you and I have been really, really busy on these, but Magic Quadrants from Gartner, critical capabilities, everybody knows these, right?
Yeah, what's interesting to me, they all have different axes in
Yep.
how they rank companies. So it's hard to go from one to the other and you're not looking at the same thing.
I
They
know.
don't have the same objectives, don't have the same metrics.
Yeah, I guess if I started one of these, I would just think I'll do a list, but nobody
Yeah.
does a list, huh? They all do a graphic and we're
If
used
we
to
could do a 3D, they will do 3D.
yeah. Well, maybe that's an idea for the next iteration. But yeah, Gartner does these quadrants. Um, IDC does this bubble kind of diagram, as you can see on the lower side,
Yeah.
and then GigaOM has their own format, as we'll talk about more. But in storage, it's interesting for us, right? Because they've had coverage on block storage, file and object, but now maybe this shift to the enterprise storage platform is an interesting one, right? We've seen that happen. So things are moving. It makes it a little trickier, I think, for some of the buyers. As you read this, it does make it harder for vendors as well because the criteria change. But do you have any sense for why the shift to enterprise storage platforms is happening?
I don't know exactly why this is changing. Maybe a move from some of the large vendors that offer more than one product. They would
Yeah,
like to be evaluated as one large solution as opposed to a pinpoint solution.
yeah,
Sometimes a company needs 10 products to actually check a mark on, for example, file or object. They need more than one. So I think some large companies will prefer an enterprise than rather than a specific technology-based quadrant.
yeah. It's a great point because for years within file and object storage, we would submit one product, and we noticed that other companies might submit one or two products, right? One
Yeah.
file and one object. So a lot of differences there. I do think Gartner still has a lot of recognition here, and IDC for me is good in quantitative research, but their MarketScape is gone away. I think the last time the object storage one published was like 4 or 5 years ago. So,
Well, based on your slide, you can see SwiftStack, so it's a very old MarketScapes for sure.
and I think that is the last one. You're right. So that might be pre-pandemic era.
Yeah.
All right. So with that, let's talk about this one called the radar reports. And as it sounds, it looks like a radar screen. They kind of have a quadrant model, but I think there's overlying dimensions that we have to think about, right? So how it works is that vendors like us are asked to submit an RFP, okay? And the RFP is fairly lengthy. It's not as long as the Gartner one, but even if you don't submit the RFP, you can be included. In fact, you often are, right? And then there's all these
This
dimensions.
I don't understand. So how do they get the information when the company doesn't submit?
I think it has to be based on just public information, what they can find on websites, right? And what they can maybe read in documentation. If
But
it's
some of the data they ask is under NDA, so it wouldn't be on a website because it's by definition
right.
protected
So,
information.
yeah, that makes it tricky, right? I would say you're right, because it's in the vendor's interest to submit.
Yeah.
But as we said, we can't do 10 a year, right? It's a lot of time. And sometimes we don't think we're actually in the category, right? So I can understand why vendors choose to not submit, but then you're sort of at a disadvantage.
Yep.
The way to look at these, though, I guess, is that closest to the center is the best position for the vendor. That would be the leader thing. But then we see that there's these other color codings, right? So within the circle, the dark gray circle, you're a leader, but then you have forward mover, fast mover, outperformer. I guess that's their evaluation of what they think your trajectory is. Is that kind of the way you interpret it?
That's the way that I interpret it as well. I must say there's a lot of dimension in that graph, so it's not easy to get it. Quick question: see Red Hat, you know if it's Ceph or Gluster or if it's both product at the same time? How do they evaluate?
Yeah, this one. So this one, I should have said it here on the slide, is the file system one. So I'm guessing it's Gluster. It's not Ceph, right? In this case. That's my interpretation, but they do put the vendor name, not the product name, huh? So that's
Yeah.
another maybe.
I wish they would put the product name. I think it
Yeah.
would be.
Yeah. And I think that's equally true for Gartner, how they put the vendor name, not the product name. So yeah, there's a lot to look at here, but just generally you look at the axes of mature vendors, innovative vendors on the bottom, and then east to west, you have feature play and platform play. For me, I guess it's intuitive, but I'm not exactly sure how to understand feature, right? That means you're not quite as inclusive as a platform. That's my interpretation.
So what jumps out to me is I know a lot of this product very, very well, and they don't do the same thing. So you wouldn't buy Nutanix to solve a problem that you solve with Hammerspace. There's
Yeah.
no way.
Yeah.
Or you wouldn't deploy Cohesity to solve a Cumulo problem.
Yeah.
And don't get me started on Pure Storage. It's kind of you're kind of comparing things that have very little overlap in the field.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we'll see it again in the object storage one. But here you're right. There's 15 vendors in the file storage one, and arguably hyperconverged. Yeah, we know they have a file system embedded, but I'm going to buy hyperconverged, right?
Yeah.
I'm not going to buy file
If you need hyperconverged storage, you're not going to buy Scality.
Right.
And so why are we in the same quadrant?
Yeah. It is a bit of an apples and oranges and bananas there. So I think this observation you made gets even more interesting as we look at the next one. So here's the object storage radar. And as you said, we've done this now for a few years. So last year, 2024, they had over 20 vendors, 21 to be exact.
Yeah.
It's much bigger than before. But now take a look at what you said, right? Look at the breadth of offerings that are included here. I see a tape vendor. I see SpectraLogic, right? For example.
Yeah. And we know that Weka partners with object storage. So how come they're competing here? And Storj, which enterprise is going to use Storj, right? But at least it's not in the center of a circle, but it's very interesting to see them.
Yeah. I think the inclusion criteria must therefore be, do you have an S3 API? Right?
Okay.
It seems to boil down to that. But yeah, I mean, hyperconverged, file, HDD vendors, tape vendors, some open source, some commercial. It's quite interesting, right? And then can we say it's also getting crowded in that upper right? I mean, you have half of them in the what you would think of as the platform maturity quadrant, but then almost everybody on the left side or on the right side, sorry.
So how do you explain the tape vendors on this one?
Well, SpectraLogic has a product called Black Pearl, and Black Pearl has an S3 API.
So that's all the
Does it have an S3 API or does it have a Glacier API? I'm
Okay.
not exactly sure.
So this time we
Or-
see IBM and no Red Hat. Interesting.
Yeah, yeah, you're right. So it's both, I guess it's both Ceph and the old CleverSafe product, Cloud Object Storage, right?
Yeah.
So in a way, they offer two. Okay. So I think in net, we both see it the same, right? It's getting broad, it's getting a little converged in an upper sector, and it's including some vendors that you might not think are the same thing. So maybe that sort of leaves us with what we think of these, right? And certainly we can admit that radar reports are one of the remaining reports that actually do vendor rankings, right? There's Gartner, there's this one, but IDC doesn't seem to be doing them, and we don't see it from others. And you have to admit, Giorgio, it must be complex to rank them all, right? Because everybody's different at some level, even when you're in the same category, right? And then I think you and I observed that year after year, there is a lot of change. So if you're looking at somebody that's a leader in one year, it can change a lot the following year. Somebody might become quite down or quite up, right? And maybe that makes sense, but it makes it a little hard to predict.
I think more transparency in the change of criteria or the change of what influence the ranking would be useful. And I know you don't want to game the system and give a criteria too early, but maybe
Yeah.
at the end, just to say, oh, the ranking, this is what we consider the most important. This is the other thing we consider the most important.
Yep.
Because that's and why? Why is very important, and why is it important? Because I think that will help the. At the end of the day, it's all about the buyer, the end user, being able to make an informed decision. I think explaining the reason why things are laid out this way will help the end user.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And maybe this is why we can kind of wrap up on these bullets, right? If I was a buyer and we buy some things, right? We have SaaS products and other
Yeah.
products in-house. But for buyers of this type of tech, it may help if there is only a set of products that fit the actual criteria. I think once there's too many and too much variance, it gets a little confusing. And then your point about the criteria, right? If everybody's bunched up, it could indicate that that's the issue, right?
Yeah.
And why not? Why not have the community or the buyers, the users of the report actually have some input on that? So I would
So
agree
I
with
was earlier this week. I was talking to a large new AI service provider,
that.
and they wanted to select an object storage platform. And I asked which report are they looking at, and well, it was ChatGPT.
Uh-huh. Okay. That may become the new analyst,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. Well, that's an interesting observation on its own, right? It does seem to be a change in this whole big analyst community, and maybe people are self-researching. Yeah. Well, I think maybe to close, I would also say that having too many dimensions, the axes, the color coding, the circles, it's a lot to digest. Again, I understand that this is a complex process, but from a vendor perspective, I would also say if you don't if you decline to submit the RFP, yeah, there's some missing information, right? So maybe don't evaluate those vendors actively, or at least provide some kind of opt out.
Yeah. And do they say that the vendor didn't participate or?
No, they don't. They don't say that, right? In fact, yeah, there's another report in the storage industry called Unstructured Data Management, UDM. That's a radar report. And that seems to include like data movers, right? People that can take data from point A to point B, like cloud to on-prem, file system to object. They wanted to include object storage vendors in that because some of us have some features for that, but you can see it's not a square fit. We didn't submit the RFP, but we were still ranked. So it's an exact case of that.
So
Okay.
I think, yeah, so I agree with everything you have in here, and I would add transparency, both for the vendors and for the end users.
Yeah. Yeah. I think transparency would count. I really think that's a great way to close the conversation. All right. Well, thanks, Giorgio. Engaging as always, and we'll see you for the next one. Thank
Yeah.
you, everybody.
Well, thanks everybody.